Four Mondays. Four Mondays is a four-act play from Sonny Bleckinger, set in San Francisco in the 1980s that released in 2018 and won an award at the Here Now Festival in Kansas City, Missouri. It can also be heard wherever you get podcasts. Having listened to this around the same time as Podcast Movement 2018 on a previous episode of the podcast segment WWLT, it seemed prudent to re-listen. At less than 30 minutes per episode, and 4 episodes in total, 4 Mondays is like a fulfilling meal after skipping lunch. Everything tastes delicious, but it's hard to tell whether your appetite is impacting your taste buds. By the end, the listener is left with an unfamiliar aftertaste, despite knowing exactly what they just consumed. Food metaphors continued. To keep the food analogy going, let's say the acts of 4 Mondays are the 4 meals of the day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and dessert. Breakfast is important, but people skip it all the time. Lunch feels rushed most of the time, dinner is relaxing, and dessert is sweet. Director Sonny Bleckinger, who also plays Samuel in the audio drama, is very much a chef when it comes to eliciting positive responses but neutral emotions in a listener. This may sound like an oxymoron, but responses and emotions aren't the same things, though they are often linked. It's similar to how music can affect emotions in films. Sad orchestral music can make a scene more emotional or make an unearned scene work on a basic level. People have compared the 4-act play to filmmaker David Lynch's works. While having never seen a Lynch movie, his brand is certainly up there with some top directors in the movie industry. One could even call him an auteur if one prescribes to that theory of film. The overall tone of the piece is very much nonchalant, with an undercurrent of gray wit. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the characters who comprise the bystanders. This group is essentially the chorus from an ancient Greek stage drama. Despite how this may sound, most of the members are distinct. The characterization of the woman who sneezes is similar to how Darth Vader's breathing is as iconic as the Jaws theme. While not on the same level in the popular imagination, the detail adds a layer of uniqueness to both the character and the group where she belongs. 4.5 out of 5 stars. Rivers of the Mind Season 1. Rivers of the Mind creator Timothy Vilgiati knows how to rock a metaphor, but gets lost in the abstract more often than not. His main character, who he also voices, spends the bulk of his time in thoughts that are more confusing than the concept of love. Perhaps that's the point, however. This story is meant to be weird and trippy. Sometimes seeing the forest instead of the trees in a story is hard. The language Vilgiati uses makes this even more difficult, as the majority of it is navel-gazing. Navel-gazing is a term in fiction writing where a character is deep in their own thoughts, and nothing external happens. Sometimes these last for a paragraph or half a page. Any longer than that, and an editor might ask you to trim it back. Rivers of the Mind goes up the nasal cavity and into the brain, staying there for at least 11 episodes. What's the plot of Rivers of the Mind? Defining the plot of Rivers of the Mind is easy. It's about a young adult who takes acid and can then read people's thoughts. It's not quite telepathy, but there are certainly similarities between it and other stories dealing with the power to read minds. Where Rivers of the Mind diverges is in how the story is told. The sound effects and filters applied to the voices of this small cast can be irksome. In their defense, the mixer did a great job at creating the world which the main character of John inhabits. World in this sense being the drug-induced trip, which may or may not be real. The audio drama plays with the idea in the same way a film like Inception does. The difference is that all of the special effects are more akin to the movie Limitless. Cool but incomplete. Near the midpoint of the first season, there's a slight increase in interest as a farmer John befriends becomes more of a character. He's introduced as a stereotypical redneck, but turns into a person with a backstory that most people wouldn't expect. Once his children come onto the scene, things get complicated. It got to the point where you couldn't tell what was going on. Perhaps that was the point. But holding out for the season finale in hopes it might clear some things up was not a good idea. There were more questions about and during the final episode than the rest of the story combined. It felt like the start of a new story when the one the listener had followed was only 95% completed. 4 out of 5 stars. Greater Boston Season 1. The podcast Greater Boston reflects the closeness of people in Boston, despite it being a large city, through the medium of sound. People tend to think of big cities like New York and Chicago as nobody knows anyone or cares about them as they pass them on the street. The opening credits of each episode where local New Englanders say the names of suburbs of Boston. Places like Worcester, Framingham, Porter Square, and Cambridge all have that effect of a large homogeneous city with diversity hidden in the tall skyscrapers of downtown. The first couple episodes have a genre and style that is hard to pin down. It is almost like NPR's Serial or other investigative podcast shows, but fictionalized. While there are plenty of shows like this out there, Greater Boston tackles this blend of realistic versus fictionalized storytelling so well that it takes until the third episode for one to realize the seemingly random vignettes are linked together through characters. What makes this show great after just 5 episodes is the giant middle finger it gives to the current cultural zeitgeist surrounding big-named cities. When people think of New York City, they imagine a million other cities that movie studios have filmed on since the dawn of modern filmmaking. One such example is the first Avengers film, which claims to have the big third-act battle in New York City. In reality, it was filmed in Cleveland. Other similar examples include in-world goofs by writers or actors, where they will write or say a name of a street that doesn't exist. The more recent version of the taking of Pelham 123 is a famous or infamous example of this kind of laziness in basic research. Greater Boston does its fair share of creative license, but it's never at the expense of setting. The characters are both eccentric and down-to-earth. The mayor of the Red Line is a de facto leader of the very real transit system that most tourists will have ridden at least once during their time in Boston. The mayor treats the subway as if it were a post-apocalyptic world or one on the brink of collapse. Other characters like Gemma are a combination of relationship plot and fish-out-of-water story with a meta twist. There are so many nuances and idiosyncrasies in the first season alone that re-listening is almost required. At the same time, listening once will satisfy you emotionally and make you want to consume more seasons to see where the story goes. 4.5 out of 5 stars.
Oblivity Season 1. Zany Characters, Real Stakes. The punchlines of Oblivity are surprising yet inevitable. They're one or two steps removed from being overused. A montage of all their jokes in the first season would take at least 15 to 20 minutes to play everything back. All of them are a hit. The characters, while comedic, feel real and grounded. By the end of the season, you feel sorry for the unusual circumstances they find themselves in. On the way, the crew's complexities are explored in scenes that take the characters in a direction that adds depth to them. Lowell is a case study in creating a complex and comedic character. The psychological test of episode 6 is both a gag and hint at where season 2 might go. Fun, funny, and ace robots. A twist on the robot, Lowell's character is refreshing. For once, the robot isn't the smart one. They often play him for laughs, however, he's hysterical but also empathetic when needed. Cyber Gerbil is a riot both as a running gag and character. Whether you're a diehard fan of something or think you're the smartest person in the room, Oblivity has a character that you can see yourself as or being friends with them on some level. The whole cast has a camaraderie about them, and having met them at Hot Tales 2019, I can say they act much more like a family than their characters' interactions. In other words, their chemistry is apparent both on and off the page. 5 out of 5 stars.
A character study, Moonbase Theta Out, Season 1. Roger Bergato Fisher is the polar opposite of someone like Doug Eiffel from Wolf 359. While Eiffel and the characters of that show are comedic with a hint of darkness by the season's end, Bergato Fisher is melancholic with a dash of optimism. As Moonbase Theta Out progresses, those differences shift to create an even greater divide between them. Fortunately, Lehman Kessler is a chameleon and commits to his role in the same way someone like Tom Hardy as Ivan Locke did in the 2013 film Locke. Both that movie and this audio drama are examples of a character study from two different genres. World building and a character study? To say the world is deep as it stands at the end of Season 1 might be putting too much credit in the hands of writer-creator DJ Silvis. But based on a behind-the-scenes episode where him and the actor playing Bergato Fisher, Lehman Kessler, Season 2 will give the listener that depth, as it deals with the same events told through different eyes. As the end of Season 1 stands, the world has hints of Obsidian Entertainment's Outer Worlds video game, mixed together with a down-to-earth character study. Aside from corporations controlling regions of space, it's not anything new in science fiction. Conveying that information to a listener, as opposed to a gamer or moviegoer, is much harder. Silvis sometimes leans into a bit too strong and draws attention to the story in a way that might turn some listeners off. It's a fight between character and world rather than a balance. With a story like this, the world should be told through the eyes of the main character. While we do get some moments of heart, humor, and sadness, it's Kessler's performance that makes it stand out, not so much the words on the page. The naming convention and structure of the first season acts as a countdown, which adds a nice diegetic and non-diegetic sense of time. Episode numbers go forward, while there are 20 days until shutdown. The biggest problem is the lack of focus in the plot. However, with this being a character study, that's like complaining about a movie not being what you wanted. For what it set out to do, it mostly succeeds. 4 out of 5 stars.
Disney Animation versus Audible Original Peter Pan. Nostalgia is a powerful emotion. It can change the time and space of a room or environment. Similar to memories, nostalgia has the same problem in its inability to create an accurate account of the world after a certain amount of time. The Audible original version of Peter Pan has more to do with the theatrical production than the Disney animated film. Considering the stereotypes and racism against Native Americans in that movie, it made sense Audible Studios went with a more gender-based rivalry between Peter Pan and the Lost Boys and Tiger Lily and the Lost Girls. Bromance, or homosexuality of Peter Pan's nemesis and first mate. To say Captain Hook and Smee are in love with each other might be true in this version, but the performances of Rupert Everett and Adil Akhtar as Hook and Smee respectively make this overabundance of affection toward each other odd, especially considering how Hook treats other pirates in his crew. It's a night and day difference, and results in his character being a bit mental. Despite the heavy insinuation of the two main pirates' sexual orientation, the scenes with them are a delight. Unfortunately, while the Native American racism is gone, it's unclear how serious the crew is about sexuality or if they're holding too close to stereotypes. Deus Ex Play. Near the end of this dramatization, when Tinkerbell drinks the poison from Hook meant for Peter Pan, the fourth wall breaks with a line of dialogue that boils down to belief in the extraordinary. It's played seriously and not for laughs. However, up until this point, there was no hint of a theatrical audience that it came out of nowhere. It's clear they took inspiration and straight-up plot points from the various plays of Peter Pan. Both have this moment and it works here, it's just not as effective. There's one scene that is very well done, and it has to do with Wendy's epiphany on what it means to be a kid and an adult. The moment is real and beautifully acted. The World War II setting of London during the Blitz, for the pre-Neverland portions, also grounded the story akin to C.S. Lewis' The Chronicles of Narnia series. 4.5 out of 5 stars. Side questing. An unusual and charming tale for children and adults. Similar in tone to Signed Venus, this audio drama from Tal Minear is both lighthearted and fun. The difference between the two is the former has a main plot they follow, while not following a capital P plot might sound like a story without direction. The lack of unfocus is surprisingly well done, and the title, Side Questing, is an appropriate one for the miniature stories being told. It's a show almost for children that's obvious with its message like Dora the Explorer, but those messages are important for everyone to hear. You can listen to the episodes of Season 1 in any order, as they're mostly self-contained, but it'll be more enjoyable if you start with Hero Night and end with NPC, as there's some connective tissue between certain adventures. There is a Season 2, which may deviate from this unorthodox storytelling formula, but don't go in expecting a Brandon Sanderson epic fantasy like Mistborn or Stormlight Archive. This may be a fantasy world, but the focus isn't on the originality of the setting. There are elements of a larger world, and the main plot is present despite the main character's refusal to partake in it. Perhaps the most obvious example of the world at large is the dark wizard who lurks in the background and is mentioned every so often by characters. The main character, named Ryan, just doesn't want to go on a grand quest to defeat the Dark Lord. They'd rather adventure their way, and it doesn't feel like padding or aimless wandering for a majority of the time. Something which shouldn't work, but does. Hashtag own voices and writing the other. In making the author and protagonist the same sexuality, the power of diversity can root itself deeper than someone who just consumes stories by minorities and writes about them. The fact Tal Minear can write from experience in a fantasy world is great for people who want to understand the mindset of someone in a minority. It's the first step, but a necessary one in today's divisive climate. Not all the side quests focus on Ryan's sexuality and orientation, but even those are fun and enjoyable because of the episodes leading up to them. Where this story truly shines is with creating empathy for a marginalized group in a way children can enjoy and adults can learn from. 5 out of 5 stars. How to Bury Your Pets, a pod play about race. Race relations and mixed metaphors. How to Bury Your Pets, written by TV writer David Harris, deals with racism in the United States in a way that shows the complexities of the issue in an almost too simplistic of a method. By the end, you aren't sure what the story is trying to say about race in America, as the message is muted by the various twists the story takes. At one point in the story, a listener might assume this to be a rags to riches story at best, or a white savior stereotype at worst. By the end, you're left trying to make sense of the theme, and it's both complicated and simple at the same time. Race Identity Crisis. The story has an identity issue in the form of who the listener should root for more. It's the same problem The Prestige has in having dual protagonists. While not set up to be in an antagonistic relationship, the white versus black America real-world conflict is a very real and long-running current event in today's world. Looking past the differences in skin color, both characters are sympathetic. The white main character, Dan, is going through a divorce while Miles, the black teenager working at the pet store, is having his first child and wants to provide for the baby and the mother. Both are slightly more complex than these one-line motivations, and that's enough for the story Harris is trying to tell. For example, Miles has a business idea. The idea unfortunately turns out to be shallow and a dropped egg that goes nowhere in terms of the plot. Missed opportunity or intentional choice. While not inherently negative in terms of story, the subplot of Dan offering to look over Miles' business proposal goes nowhere, and is indicative of privilege as a whole. A fact the story addresses outright near the end. The fact it doesn't go in the direction of a white savior trope as one would expect means that the ending is both surprising yet inevitable, but also has no pathos behind it. The story ends without much closure for the two main characters. Because you expect a happy ending for both, you feel a little let down when the reality of race hits the story with a heavy dose of raw truth. 4.5 out of 5 stars. Sandman, an Audible crossover with DC Comics. A graphic crisis on Audible Earths. The first dramatization of Neil Gaiman's Sandman is a comic book come alive in a way that combines graphic audios, comic book adaptations, with CW's Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover story, loosely based on the 1980s comic book storyline of the same name by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, where the television network took the Easter egg and fan service approach to the extreme and turned off some people. Gaiman and Mag's original story about Morpheus and the other Endless is told as a more down-to-earth story. There's no extinction-level crisis here, except for the one the character of Dream/Morpheus finds himself in at the beginning of the story. The story starts out in gothic horror territory, a staple of Gaiman's career. Mags does a remarkable job of encapsulating the tone with the sound effects, and the musical score by James Hannigan is reminiscent of Danny Elfman's iconic Batman 1989 theme, though different and not as iconic. Gaiman's warm storyteller voice narrating the caption boxes of the comic book might feel out of place in the beginning, but it's what keeps the story from getting too dark. The juxtaposition of his character in the chapter 24 Hours is sadistic in the best possible way. You feel anguish at the events as they play out in your ears and wince whenever Gaiman gives you the time in 1 hour increments. The delivery and cadence of the 2-word lines are so visceral that you feel sweaty and gross for listening to what comes after. Gollum the Raven and Professor X Jr. the Sandman? James McAvoy is an interesting choice to play the Dream Lord, not because he's bad or not a good fit. This is unlike any role he's done, and if it wasn't for the accompanying PDF with cast and crew information, I would have never known that he was the voice. If you've seen M. Night Shyamalan's Split, where McAvoy played several different characters in his role as someone suffering from dissociative identity disorder, then you might recognize his talents immediately. I haven't seen the film, but his voiceover work as Sandman in this Audible original production seems to be the audio equivalent of such a taxing performance. Other recognizable actors include Andy Serkis and Arthur Darvill, and two well-known audiobook narrators, Simon Vance and Ray Porter. To say Audible is mixing the entertainment industry together in an unprecedented way might be hyperbole, but there's an element of truth to it. 4.5 out of 5 stars. An arguably narcissistic main character is not exactly the most sympathetic of characters to write about. Lauren, the lead character and self-proclaimed master thief Nightblade, is arrogant but full of imagination and repartee. The author has come out on his YouTube channel saying he's a self-proclaimed narcissist, and Lauren's personality, thinking she can outmaneuver law enforcement officers because she's the fastest in the village, is assumption bordering on arrogance. It's this quirk of hers that makes her reaction to events more frustrating than a good decision on her part. Near the end of the book, this personality trait borders on foolishness. Garrett Robinson's choice of voice for Lauren was something unexpected and went unnoticed for the first couple of chapters. He steps back into his regular accent in scenes of emotional power. The southern twang in his voice when he voices his protagonist is refreshing and unexpected in a fantasy novel where such an accent shouldn't exist. The version I listened to was the Nightblade Epic Volume 1 on Audible, which contains the first 3 novels in this series, Nightblade, Mystic, and Darkfire. The first book is also available as a podcast. Mayhap you've heard of Nightblade? The language and dialogue are dated on purpose. It gives the story a more medieval feel all around, and the narration a bit of weight. This will turn some readers off, something other modern fantasy works shy away from in their stories. As a fan of Tolkien's work, Robinson modernizes the social and cultural mores but keeps the language idiosyncrasies of something closer to Shakespeare's work. It's an interesting blend to say the least. Making the High King a woman is just one example of Robinson playing with gender roles. While this book is about a young girl according to the author, it's not a young adult book. Perhaps it's the divide between traditional and self-publishing ecosystems. I've heard that YA books aren't edited for content in traditional publishing. That said, Robinson dances that line between obscene and unsettling without being overly graphic. It's more subtle and nuanced than in your face, but putting the pieces together make you squirm a little more. If you like fantasy that blends history and language with social justice and gender roles, you'll find no better story than Nightblade. 4 out of 5 stars. The God's Head Incidental. In a time when serialized fiction is often held up as a more engaging form of storytelling than episodic shows, comes a comedy that focuses on character and some minor serialization techniques to craft a season that's quirky and a breath of fresh air. To evoke Coolio, the characters are living in a God's Head paradise, though Weird Al Yankovic may be more appropriate in this context. Saying the first 4 episodes of The God's Head Incidental uses character humor to get the audience through boring exposition and world building might sound accurate, In most other stories of this nature, the humor can come off as non-sequential, almost like an intentional maid and butler dialogue scene played for laughs instead of informing the individual. The God's Head incidental chooses a third option for explaining their world. Tell an actual story with it. It's like the creators are crafting the world and story as they go in a way a discovery writer writes a novel. A bold, dangerous, but efficient method of storytelling. It's an effective tool for someone who discovery writes their world and characters while loosely outlining the plot. This take may be entirely wrong. If someone were to pitch this audio drama, they'd be crazy not to evoke Neil Gaiman's American Gods, if only from the concepts alone. Both are stories about pagan gods who live amongst Americans. While Gaiman goes for a historical approach, God's Head incidental strives for imagination. Going back to the serial versus episodic dynamic, there's not much continuity between episodes, at least on first listen. It's not until the fourth episode that a major plot point and character comes back from the first episode. Some of the subplots are disregarded by the second episode in favor of new storylines. This Netflix-style approach of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks can work well for some stories. Assuming the above explanation is accurate to the creator's process, this is one of those stories. For those looking for a less winding path to a yet unknown goal for the season, the first 4 episodes will keep you entertained with the humor alone. 4.5 out of 5 stars. Untold Virginia, despite having only a handful of episodes out at the time of this writing, manages to grab you in a way that only an audio drama can. I've often thought that I've never heard an audio drama that couldn't also be a movie or television show. How practically no one person or team has utilized the strengths of sound by itself to make someone go, I can't see this working as well in another medium, is like a holy grail. This audio drama from one of the producers of the Wolverine audio drama from Stitcher Premium sets the bar high for subsequent audio dramas of the same style. A new age of audio drama in Untold Virginia. The Bright Sessions changed the game when it first came out. The concept and execution were both brilliant, and like Tolkien and fantasy writers, every subsequent author has to deal with his shadow in some way. Having not heard the Wolverine audio drama, I came into this not having any preconceived notions of Chloe Wilson's artistic style, other than the names of shows she has worked on for TV and streaming services, including Apple TV+, but also word of mouth from other audio drama fans, most of which came from their press kit and the cast and crew biographic pages on the podcast's website, a different class of untold entertainment. While the horror angle has been done to death since the first Jaws movie, where the implied existence of a shark, fake or not, made audiences afraid to go in the water, a story like Untold Virginia takes just 1 episode to get you invested in the characters, not only as friends, but also the differences of opinion. The show's format also lends itself well to the medium of sound, as it blends fiction and reality very well. How much is scripted versus improvised? This is a new age of audio drama, and I'm imagining the people this will inspire to create something similar or better. 5 out of 5 stars.
Leviathan Chronicles. Undersea techno thriller. Stuck undersea and in the past? As one of the pioneers of the early audio drama movement, the Leviathan Chronicles is up there with shows and companies like We're Alive, Pendant Productions, and J.C. Hutchins' techno thriller about human cloning and political espionage in the Seventh Son trilogy. At the time, nobody took podcasts seriously as an art form. The undersea techno thriller didn't wow with its story in the first few chapters of Season 1, Instead, it focused on creating a believable soundscape for a world where immortal beings exist. This was before podcast fiction exploded with a new wave of creators around 2010. Now, after a long hiatus, the third season is available on podcast feeds everywhere. You can tell Laputka and his team worked hard to make this season great, after such a long break between seasons 2 and 3. Alternate history, and temporal cultural references. Because of the hiatus between the second and third seasons, a lot of references feel dated or out of place. Did Rick and Morty exist in 2014, or does the first scene take place in the future? How long has the virus attack been going on? Originally released as the first part of the Leviathan Chronicles, Season 2, any changes made to the story are a mystery. Director Nobi Nakanishi said in a Facebook livestream that a version of Chapter 39 existed in 2014, but that it's not the same as the one we got in 2020. The structure and pacing of this season work in a similar way to Star Wars Clone Wars episodes of a given season. That is, one's grouped together to form a story inside a larger serialized adventure. The most interesting story beat happens in Chapter 44. Motivations are revealed and plots turn upside down in the second part of the Buffer Station chapters. After the revelation, the story shifts to the computer hacking plot thread established in the season's opening chapters. There's a slight ambiguity to the characters, making their actions morally gray in almost all cases. You aren't sure who to trust. Dips and troughs. While the true nature of the alien's visit centuries ago is fascinating from a secret history genre's perspective, Clarikin, Lizette, and Harlequin are tied with Tully, Oberlin, and their group in terms of listener engagement. An entire episode dedicated to rescuing Oberlin from the Yakuza could have been cut or combined with another plot line to avoid the inherent comparisons to filler. It may have been, but not enough to make me forget Fish Egg Freddy. In terms of plot, the underwater techno-thriller in its third season pulls no punches when they matter. The show bides its time for the opening chapters to introduce new characters rather than jump right back into the action of the already established cast. It's a risky move, but the amount of effort put into the ending makes it worth the time spent. You can feel the emotion with the acting, sound effects, and dialogue written on the page. The music is the icing on the cake and creates a truly cinematic moment for sound. 4 out of 5 stars.